My name is Glyn Jones. I'm head of the Knowledge, Information and Records Management team at the Central Data and Digital Office for Government, which is part of the Cabinet Office. So welcome to the Cabinet Office as well. And they're basically my three welcomes. The fourth really is to welcome you to this Lustre workshop, and I'm going to hand over to the Principal Investigator, Dr. Lisa Jones.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Glyn. Thank you everyone for joining, in person or online. So this is actually our second workshop. We organized the first workshop in January. Perhaps some of you were already here. So it's really great to be back again, at the Cabinet Office and to talk about AI and the management of digital archives. So let me say a few words about the Lustre project for those of you who don't know it. So as Glyn said, I'm Lisa Jones. I'm the principal investigator on this project. So what we want to do with the Lustre project, the full title is Unlocking Our Digital Past with Artificial Intelligence. I'm based at Loughborough University, and what we want to do is to better understand how AI can help improve the preservation, access, and use of government archives produced in digital form. The project is funded by the HRC, the Arts and Humanities Research Council. So of course, we are very grateful to our funder. We're also grateful, of course, to our project partners. So the Cabinet Office is, of course, a main project partner. We are working with the National Archives as well. So this afternoon, John Sheridan is going to give a talk. John Sheridan is, of course, based at TNA, at the National Archives. So you have the website on this slide if you want to have a look. We also have a listserv as well. So if you want to join the listserv, that's a great way to keep abreast of news, future events that we are going to organize as part of this project. So I believe Cecilia is going to put the link to the listserv in the chat if you want to have a look. Otherwise, you can just connect to our website. So let me say a few words about the program today. So we start, so for those people who joined us online, so we are starting right now with a first talk by Dr. Keegan McBride, who's based at Oxford, at the Oxford Internet Institute. And the title of his talk is Artificial Intelligence in the Public Sector, Separating Myth from Reality. We have a second talk by James Lapin, who's over there, based at Loughborough University and also at the Cabinet Office. We have a coffee break, and then I'm going to give a short talk about AI and archives from a researcher's point of view. We have the lunch break, and we are coming back with John Sheridan at 1:30. And then we have a speaker who's based in the US, Professor Jason Barron at University of Maryland. And he's going to talk about NARA. So it will be interesting to have this US perspective as well. So not only the UK perspective, but also the US perspective. And then we are coming back at 3 p.m. just to conclude and to share our thoughts about the workshop. So again, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm going to hand over to Keegan, our first speaker.
Sweet, thank you very much for having me. Sorry that I can't be there in person, and thanks for the flexibility for letting me present online. Let me just share my screen. Sorry, 1 second here. Cool. And now everybody should be able to see my slides, correct? I will just assume that everybody can see them, and I'll take it from here. Yep. So, all right, cool. Thank you very much. So my name is Dr. Keegan McBride. I'm a lecturer in AI Government and Policy at the Oxford Internet Institute, and I'm also the course director for our MSc program in Social Science of the Internet. And today I'm going to be talking a little bit about artificial intelligence in the public sector and sort of trying to set the foundation about, AI in government. And a lot of this is based off a report that I helped co-author a couple of years ago with the OECD's Observatory for Public Sector Innovation, titled Hello World, Artificial Intelligence and its Use in the Public Sector. So really briefly, I will talk a little bit about digitalization of the public sector more broadly, get into some definitions of AI, talk a little bit more about what AI is and is not, go through those expectations versus reality, and then talk about some things that I think are important for enabling the use of artificial intelligence in the public sector. So as a starting point, AI in government is part of a much broader transformation, I would say, about digitalization of the public sector, right? So within this, you have things related to, I don't know, digital governance more broadly, digital bureaucracies, rules as code, digital identity systems, data exchange, co-creation, digital public services, database decision-making, digital standards, Freedom of Information Act requests, the digital capacity of the public sector bureaucracy. There are many things that you could study and which are important for enabling the digitalization of the public sector. One component of this is artificial intelligence. But the problem is nobody really agrees on what AI is and is not. I think recent research has found, I don't know, something like 28, 29 different competing definitions of AI that are constantly in use. So the OECD in 2019 offered that artificial intelligence is a machine-based system that can, for a given set of human-defined objectives, make predictions, recommendations, or decisions that influence real or virtual environments, and there are systems that are designed to operate with varying levels of autonomy. The EU AI Act basically says that AI systems mean software that are developed with one or more techniques and approaches listed in Annex 1 of the AI Act, and for a given set of human-defined objectives, generate outputs such as content predictions, recommendations, and so on and so forth. In the US, the NIST, they talk about AI being the capability of a device to perform functions that are normally associated with human intelligence, such as reasoning, learning, and self-improvement. And more recently in the UK, in the new pro-innovation approach to AI, they had this sort of two-step approach to defining AI related to, adaptivity and autonomy. And you could keep going down this rabbit hole if you wanted to. You can start talking about narrow AI and general AI. You could start talking about, where do you start thinking this is artificial intelligence? When is it just statistics? When is it just like a regression? I have my own view. I don't really want to go into it. But what I want to make very clear is that people still don't really agree on what they're talking about. I think everybody can, maybe they see something and they go, okay, yes, that is AI. But oftentimes what you see is not what you get. There are also situations where, I don't know, chatbots are actually being driven by platform workers in a developing country where they're literally just answering questions. I have seen startups that have AI face detection, where it's just a customer support agent behind the scenes comparing two pictures and saying yes or no. So even if somebody is saying they're using AI, it doesn't necessarily mean that they are. And even if they are using AI, depending on who you ask, they may say yes or no. It's very, very convoluted. But okay, in the public sector, people have been talking about artificial intelligence for quite some years now. Different examples, but particularly coming from consultancies like, I don't know, EY, Deloitte, and so on, why AI in the public sector are a winning formula, how artificial intelligence could transform government. More than half of Europeans want to replace lawmakers with AI, study says. AI is going to bring about the end of government. You hear this sort of everywhere. Whether or not that's true, we'll talk a little bit more about it. But what could you do with AI in the public sector? People talk about chatbots, they talk about natural language processing, automation, decision-making, healthcare, safety, governance, public services. Now with the increasing sort of popularity of LLMs, you start to hear more about using AI to replace bureaucrats and these sorts of use cases. But okay, let's put that aside for a second, and then let's try to delve more into what AI actually means within the context of the public sector, right? Because artificial intelligence is more than just an algorithm, it's more than just data. You have to, have a lot of insight into the metadata. Are you using it for forecasting? What's your IT architecture like? How are you getting the data? How are you exchanging the data? How are you managing these systems? How do you integrate it into your business processes? Are you compliant with GDPR and other data privacy law? How are you building it? Are you doing it in-house? Are you procuring it? If you're procuring it, do you have the capacity to procure it? There are many, many things that you have to get in order before you can start taking AI and put it into the public sector and expect to get some sort of value out of it. And this goes back to, these ideas around digitalization of the public sector, right? That if you want to do AI, there are some things that you have to have first, like the necessary infrastructure. You're not going to be able to run AI if all of your documents are, for example, in PDFs, or in the case of Germany, if you're still using fax machines, if you're completely reliant on Excel. A lot of these things are going to become very, very hard and probably not make much sense unless you have the proper foundations in place. So, okay, what are the expectations? I mean, what do people hear and what do they say when they're thinking about AI in the public sector? Here are some examples. Colleagues of mine did a recent report for the EU where they identified 628 different use cases across Europe of AI in the public sector. So if you're interested in that, you can check the data set out from the EU AI Watch initiative. But in Estonian, we have Bureaucrat AI, which was this idea to bring about chatbots and virtual servants for every citizen, virtual assistants, I guess they call them. From Sweden, there was this 10-guy interviewing for job applicants to try to remove human bias out of the equation. An example from Chicago is not really AI, but people sort of say that it was, where they were using machine learning, but literally just a regression to optimize the order of food safety inspections and catch critical food safety violations basically a week earlier compared to their traditional way of doing it. You start hearing people talk about, okay, we're going to use AI to, stop crime and do predictive policing. Horrible decision, but nonetheless, you hear a lot about it. COVID-19, you started seeing machine learning being applied to do like image recognition and detect the distance between people to identify if they were observing and following these sort of distance requirements and isolation. You could do the object detection. There was a initiative globally called like Let's Do It or World Cleanup Day, and they were using object detection with satellite imagery to identify like large areas of garbage, and then volunteers would go and pick this up. So there are many things that people are thinking about when it comes to AI in the public sector. Chatbots are always popular. This went around a couple of years ago, has never happened, but people were talking about whether or not AI could be a fair judge in court. I don't think Estonia has actually ever done this, even though they keep talking about it for some reason. So that's the picturesque ideal version. What you hear, especially now with ChatGPT and other LLMs becoming, so popular, you hear about it all the time. Like, okay, we're just going to make our government more efficient by using AI. We're going to start having chatbots. Everybody can have their own virtual assistant. We're going to start using ChatGPT to generate documents, or we can use AI to detect fraud and so on and so forth. But the reality is, one, if we look globally, most governments don't have the necessary prerequisites to use AI in the public sector. There's certainly a big Northwest and developed and developing country bias. Secondly, the government is not the private sector, right? If the government makes a mistake that discriminates against a bunch of people, that's really, really bad. It's still bad if it happens in the private sector, but the impact is slightly different. Similarly, the private sector is often using AI to improve customer acquisition or drive innovation, or profit maximize and these sorts of things, but these aren't necessarily the same goals of the public sector. So, okay, taking the bias and other sorts of issues aside, which I think most people are probably familiar with, there's this situation as well. During COVID-19, the state of New Jersey in the US put out nationwide news alerts saying, hey, do you know COBOL? Because we can't fix our unemployment system because it's running on a 40-year-old mainframe. We're literally talking about government agencies that haven't updated their stuff since like the 80s or the 90s. You have a workforce that's getting older. There's often cuts to the budgets of the public sector. And so what this means is public sector agencies often have a situation where there's not enough funding. They tend to have outdated technology. The workforce is aging. They don't necessarily have the experience and skill to implement AI. They might not have the ability to procure this stuff. They might not understand the market. There's plenty of issues around trade secrecy, about data and infrastructure. There's capacity problems about what happens if you become overly reliant on the private sector. And what this means is many governments are starting to say, okay, if we're going to do AI in the public sector, we need to, allocate funding for it. And so what happens is there's often funding given for doing tests or pilots, but nothing for sustainability. So there's a ton of AI pilots that are going on, but whether or not these remain to create impact and whether or not they're sustainable is another story. But one of the most important things to talk about, I think, is procurement. And it's particularly for these reasons that at the moment, most of the artificial intelligence knowledge is contained within the private sector, and in particularly within SMEs, NGOs, and similar sorts of smaller organizations. So if that's the case, if governments are going to become, procure more and more AI systems, there are certain things that need to happen or which would be beneficial, let's say. So on the one hand, it's probably going to increase, which means you need to be able to do it better. The problem is it's very challenging. In a recent paper, my colleagues and we explored how procurement of artificial intelligence systems differed than procurement of other sort of technology systems. So you need to build this competency. People have tried to develop guidelines. I mean, in the UK, they have this procurement in a box that they did. Estonia has something. Serbia has something. There are examples. Amsterdam has something, but these guidelines tend to not be obligatory. They tend to not really be applied. And while they certainly can help to structure procurement a little bit better, whether or not they lead to long-term impact or improve the procurement process remains to be seen. And similarly, as I mentioned, that most procurement in the public sector tends to favor larger sort of corporations. We're talking IBM, Microsoft, Oracle, and so on. We need to figure out how we can involve the smaller companies, but it's also not okay just to say, let's just get rid of procurement and, let government organizations buy whatever they want and let private sector companies do whatever they want to do. So it's about thinking how to use procurement in a strategically smart way, let's say. And similarly, you're not going to be able to do this on your existing infrastructure. So this has to be part of a broader transformation that involves your infrastructural and organizational practices, your business practices, and processes. And if you're not able to fix these first, also, there's the mindset issue, legal issues, regulatory issues. You're going to have a hard time if you start trying to move in this artificial intelligence direction. And I think that I'm trying to sort of run through this fairly quickly, just so there's time for questions and comments at the end. Moving forwards, what are the next steps? What do we like to see? If you haven't seen any of the slides change, then I'm very sorry. But has everybody seen the slides change? Just there's a comment in the chat about it, but I think you could also change. Okay, people are putting the thumbs up. Good. Carl, I think if I'm right, you should be able to navigate with yourself through the slides. Okay, cool. Sorry for that little pause, but in terms of next steps, basically, what do I think is important? One, education. We need to bring people up to speed about what AI is and is not. Elements of AI is a really cool course that's been put together out of Finland, but is sort of now spreading all over Europe. Don't skip the foundations. Make sure you're ready for AI before you take the dive. If you're still running everything, I don't know, with paper documents, if you're still using fax machines, you're probably not ready to do this yet. We really need to improve data quality. We really need to improve the infrastructure. We really need to be able to, have the systems in place to exchange data, to move data between organization A and organization B. You need to know what the data is, what it isn't, how it's described. What we think of in terms of core skill sets of public servants and for public servants is changing. Almost certainly the required skill sets are going to change. There's going to be increased need for understanding of, statistics and having core technical skills. We're going to start seeing innovation and transformations in how procurement is done. And really, I think most importantly, AI is not only about the technology, it is much more than that. And you can't think that you're going to solve problem X if only you had this new AI solution, right? It has to be part of this broader organizational, environmental, sort of mental transformation. And it's not a cure-all, but strategic implementation of AI for specific relevant problems could have a large positive benefit for society. And I think you'll hear from the other lecturers coming up throughout the day that one area where you do see a lot of impact or the potential for impact relating to AI is around document management. And certainly a lot of examples that I have seen in the real world where you are seeing impact is within this domain. And similarly, just some final thoughts. As I said, just to reiterate again, it's probably not the best or the first solution you should try. Usually there are things that can do it better than AI, but if you go through this process, if you go through your own mental checklist and you arrive at the fact that AI is the best tool for the solution, make sure that the funding is there to not only pilot it, but also for the sustainability. You will hear a lot of hype around AI in the government. It's really important to look past that because the real benefits really are not likely as cool or as flashy as they want, people make it out to be. A lot of times people hear AI and they think robots and, I don't know, self-driving cars and all these sorts of things. But realistically, it's usually something running on the back end that's skimming over documents and making sure private information isn't leaking or something like that, or doing data validation or, doing machine translation or something to this effect. And I think something which I didn't really talk about here, but what I think is probably the most realistic outcome of all of this is that when it comes to AI in the public sector, the most likely outcome and where the biggest benefits are probably going to occur is related to intelligence augmentation. So it's about using AI as like a tool to augment and improve the ability of the public servant to do their job. There's a lot of interesting work on intelligence augmentation by this guy Douglas Engelbart, who was at Stanford in many decades ago, but still highly relevant to AI. And so with that, I would end my talk, and I think we have about 10 minutes for questions, and would be happy to discuss with you all. Thanks for having me.
Great, thank you so much, Keegan. That was fantastic. So yes, we have a bit of time for questions. So perhaps we can start with questions from people in the room. And I'm happy to start with the first question for you, Keegan, because I was really interested in what you said about the outsourcing of AI. Could you perhaps expand a little bit more why it's so tempting perhaps to outsource AI? Is it an issue with skills shortage, for example, the fact that not many people have these kind of skills, and it can be difficult to find in-house, within the public sector or even within the university sector. So would you like perhaps to expand a little bit about this, about the outsourcing of AI?
Yeah, I think basically in many governments they have, let's say, internal tech. So there are some governments which do have a lot of internal capacity for doing IT related work, technology related work, but they don't necessarily have the ability to program their own models. They don't necessarily have the ability to get up their own infrastructure or move everything onto the cloud or whatever else. So what they tend to do is try to fix this capacity gap by relying on the private sector and procuring this sort of capacity, bringing in, buying models from private sector companies, buying the infrastructure to support it, rather than having it in-house. And this creates a really weird situation where oftentimes you get this like hodgepodge of different private actors where you have, I don't know, X systems, but Y different infrastructures, and you can't actually, it's dangerous, and it also has this scary feedback loop, which is that once you start to outsource the capacity related to AI, you're not actually able to build it up in-house, and you become more and more and more and increasingly dependent on the private sector. So I've seen this quite heavily in Estonia. There are many other countries where you also are seeing this, where at least for the foreseeable future, they see themselves as being reliant on outsourcing and procurement because they just don't have the capacity in-house to do it. And this is especially true when it comes to like cutting edge applications around AI. I think we're at the point where, simple chatbots and things like that, you could spin up pretty quickly with your own internal IT like capacities, but the government isn't going to be able to, do their own LLM or something like that that's able to compete with OpenAI at the moment. Like this sort of stuff is just not really within their ability to attain, at least at the moment. So that's what I would say that.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Keegan. Do we have questions from people in the room? questions at this point. So, yes.
Thank you. That was really interesting. Do you think that because in this sector the pace of change is so fast, and due to the nature of setting something up in-house in government, that tends to take a very long time, do you think that that's a big problem / how could we fix that? Just because, like, if we start a program now to start something in-house and it takes 5 years, we're already then like 5 years behind the private sector, which can adapt more quickly.
Yeah, I mean, this is
Okay,
I heard, yeah, I got it. But I think this is the issue that public sector officials always have to face. And I think it's an issue that people don't really understand, which is that when the government is doing budgeting or when they're building these new sorts of capacities, they're not working on, like a couple of weeks time scale. We're talking multiple years in advance. And this is really hard because what happens then is you start to build up this legacy infrastructure, and we're already seeing this now, right? Like many governments that are beginning to digitalize, they're still using infrastructure from 10, 20, 30 years ago, and it's really hard to replace that. So I think there's certainly, it's not to say that all outsourcing and procurement is bad, but there just needs to be a balance in how it's done. I think when it comes to new digital systems, particularly around like infrastructure, we're going to see increased reliance on like hyperscale cloud providers, let's say, because France tried to build a sovereign cloud, it didn't work. I mean, UK still is trying to move these things, but most like cloud initiatives are reliant on this cooperation with the private sector, and that's just due to economies of scale. So I think we're going to start seeing increased interdependence between the private and public sector more than we've seen in the past when it comes to like digitalization, at least. But I think it's also important to realize that you do need to develop this capacity in-house, at least to the extent, and this can look, it can take many different forms, but at the very least, right, you need to have someone who has the understanding of how these systems work, who's able to write procurements, who's able to understand like what is possible and what is not possible. I was advising one government, and they wanted to procure a new AI system to detect accidents, but only on roads that this government agency was responsible for. And then you ask them about how many accidents happened on this road, and they said like 7 over the course of the year. I mean, at this point, you might as well roll a dice. But what happened was there was funding available for it, and so they felt that they had to do it, but nobody actually understood how it worked. So it's really a fine balance, I guess. Sorry for being a bit rambly there.
Great, thank you, Keegan. Okay, so we have a few questions in the chat. A question from Kevin, who's asking about digital accessibility. So for digital accessibility, there are standards that are already used in procurement. So would you think something similar is possible, achievable, or even desirable for AI? So parallel between digital accessibility and AI.
Yeah, so the EU is working quite a lot on this. Let me try to find this. Well, anyway, the EU has been pushing for new standard clauses for procurement of AI that you could be adopted into procurements, and I think they're based out of the ones that they're using in Amsterdam. So there's certainly effort to develop these sort of standard clauses for procurement of AI. I can try to find it and send it around. But if you Google something like European Union and procurement and standard clauses, then I'm sure something will come up. Certainly not as developed as when it comes to like accessibility standards, but there's movement in this direction. And the private sector also like supports it as well. When I've talked with private sector companies who have been working with governments that are developing their own guidelines and standards, they're like, yes, this is awesome because we can actually participate in the procurements because they make sense now. Whereas before they were asking us to do things that either A, weren't technically possible, or B, were written so poorly that we didn't understand what they wanted. So there's a win-win by developing these standards and improving the procurement processes.
Okay, great. Thank you, Keegan. Another question from Carl, who's asking, how do we overcome fear of AI and AI bias given the negative media stories? Because of course there are many negative media stories. So what do we do with this fear of AI and AI bias?
Yeah, I mean, this is at the end of the day, a lot of this stuff comes back to better regulation, and this is why the AI Act in the EU is being so heavily debated, and why the recent regulatory approach put forth by the UK, at least in the academic circles, was fairly criticized, I would say. I mean, bias and these sorts of things definitely happen, and there's something that need to be taken into account, but a lot of this can be fixed with better procurement and better regulation and better oversight. To give an example, there was a paper 4 or 5 years ago where they received they sent out Freedom of Information Act requests in the US, I think like 40 something different systems, AI systems that were in use, and only 3 or 4 could even send back the documentation and answer how they worked. So oftentimes governments are buying systems and they don't understand what they're doing or how they're working, and that shouldn't be allowed to continue. And it's just it's a matter of fixing the regulatory process or empowering existing regulators to operate within the AI space.
Great, thank you. We have time for one more question. So a question from Janet, who is asking, do you have any examples of intelligence augmentation as the biggest opportunity for AI use in the public sector? So a question about intelligence augmentation.
I think like for the intelligence augmentation, it's basically the idea that you're using this tool to allow you to operate more efficiently. So when I talk about Douglas Engelbart, he had this mother of all demos, I guess in like the 60s, and they were already trialing like version real-time document editing. They did video conferencing. He invented the mouse, all these different sorts of things. So it was about using tools to allow us to operate and do our jobs more efficiently and more effectively, but not necessarily replacing us. And I think when it comes to the use of things like around LLMs, this is where you're going to see the real impact, where and also things like, I don't know, GitHub Copilot, for example, for developing solutions. As a developer, it's really nice because you can use it to generate templates and sort of boilerplate that you don't have to do yourself anymore. So it can actually make you a more efficient and more effective developer. Somebody had their hand up, and I feel bad that we never called on them, because they put it up.
We are using the chat, actually. So if people could put their questions in the chat, that would be great. But unfortunately, we're running out of time for this particular session. So thank you so much, Keegan, for your great talk.